Here's Nick. When the baby was born, his baby.
Well, that was his. And what's his baby called?
Neve.
You're going to be hearing the story of Della, who's going to tell us what happened in the UK in the 1970s and 80s during the infected blood scandal. Her story is tragic and at times tricky to hear, but it's really important for us to understand what happened. Della lost her son Nick following treatment for haemophilia with contaminated NHS products. Staggeringly, it has taken more than 30 years for a public inquiry to be launched to find out why thousands of people were infected, how the authorities covered things up, and the devastating impact on their families. I wanted to make this episode because this is a scandal we should all be aware of and try to ensure never happens again. But I also think Della's story is representative of a bigger trust issue we face today. What do we do when the people who are meant to protect us violate their power?
There'd been no history of this in our family.
How old were you when you had the twins?
30... How old was I, Dan? 36 or something like that?
That's Dan you can hear, Della's husband. He was in the kitchen when we were recording.
We lived in Shepherd's Bush then, and although Dan is not Jewish, I am, and I wanted to have them circumcised, and Dan was fine with that, and we had it done at home. And his mum had come from New York, and she was a child nurse. So at some point after they were all right, they stopped crying. She went up to look at them, see they were all right, and Nick was lying in a pool of blood.
And how old was
6
Nick?
weeks.
6 weeks.
They were. So Lynn and Dan rushed him round the corner to Queen Charlotte's, which was where he'd been born, there. And they took him in, and when they came back, maybe they put him in an incubator, and I think we went up there, and they asked if there was any haemophilia in the family, and I said,
Did you know what it was at that point?
Well, only via the Russian royal family and history. No, I had no idea. We had no idea. Anyway, so it turned out that he did have haemophilia, but Jake didn't, his twin. And they told us then it was a 1 in a million chance for a non-carrier to have this conversion. My luck. Anyway, so the first time we went up to Great Ormond Street, that's when they explained what it was, the missing clotting factor in the chain, and that he would have to be careful not to damage himself badly, but that there was treatment for it. As babies, they were put on cryoprecipitate, which was, I didn't know that then, was pure and was not contaminated. One of our friends from San Francisco was staying with us in Shepherd's Bush then, and she was looking after Jake, and she'd laid out this quilt in the sitting room. She'd laid Jake on it, on his stomach, and he was sort of looking at her and whatever when we came back, and it had been horrifying because to try and give an intravenous injection with the vein so small, Nick had screamed the place down, and Dan and I were incredibly shaken and wondering how the hell we were going to cope with him. And we laid him down, Nick, on his stomach, him next to Jake, and he stopped crying, and he turned his head to Jake, and Jake turned his head to him, and they started laughing. Louise, our friend from San Francisco, and Dan and I, we sort of looked at each other and went, okay, we'll deal with it, we will. Now, we were really fortunate because we ran our own business in Googe Street, and Dan built a marvellous little 2-storey house there in the office and a play area, which I sewed covers for blocks of foam so that there was a big play area that was really safe. Of course, they weren't rolling around, and the boys stayed with us at work till they went to school. So that's how it started.
And you had a friend who we've been talking about that sounds like has been very special in your life. That was
absolutely.
living in America. What was her name?
Her name was Irene. She came from Manor House, and she had lived next door me in the immigration hostel in Israel, and she had been on a different kibbutz. She met someone and got married, and when the boys were about, I don't know, 2 or something, I mean, we were in touch all the time anyway, she said, "What treatment does Nick get?" And I said, "Oh, he's getting this cryoprecipitate."
Haemophilia patients treated with cryoprecipitate are exposed to hundreds or even thousands of donors during their lifetime. This isn't a problem if the blood is being carefully monitored to ensure the donors are free from disease. But during the 1980s, blood products were being imported from the United States where anyone could sell their blood, even prison inmates and drug addicts.
She said, "But does he get whatever it was called then?" I said, "No, they don't switch them onto that till they're 4. And she said, "But you can't let Nick have that because you know what it's like here. They buy it from America and you know what they do to get the blood."
Was this the factor concentrate?
Yes. And I did know because we'd seen in New York people selling blood down on the Bowery. We'd see all over America. I mean, Irene and I even discussed whether we should bring is sort of blood to America for ourselves if we might need it. We already knew that the blood in America was disgusting because people were paid and it came from prisoners, and it came from God knows where.
Even drug addicts were allowed to sell their blood.
Anybody could sell their blood. It was terrible. She said, "You mustn't do it because there's something really weird happening, even worse than just selling." She said, "I don't know what it is yet." She was one of these people. She was a legal secretary, and so she had access to tons of knowledge. She said, "When will they switch, Nick?" And I said, "Well, when he's 4. She said, "You mustn't let him." So I brought stuff. She sent me articles. I brought it to them.
You took it to Great Ormond Street?
Yes, I gave it to Colin. And when it came time for him to switch, I wouldn't let them do it. I caused an absolute scene there. I just said, no, you cannot. You've got to keep him on cryo. You can't.
Do you think they believed you?
Well, I knew I was right. And I knew by the way they were acting that they knew I was right. So I don't think it was a matter of believe me. I think they wanted to limit it. They didn't want to put the wind up people. I'm sure of it. Anyway, they kept him on it. And there wasn't anything else except the American imported stuff. But Dan and I were very unhappy. And then that was when The Guardian wrote this leader article about, it was starting, AIDS or HIV was starting to
around
be well
the mid-80s, right?
Well, it was earlier, 1981. Mm-hmm. Irene had already told me people were there, gays mostly, but people were getting this disease. They didn't know what it was, but it was associated with blood, so there was even more reason not to have American blood. So The Guardian wrote a leader article saying that there were possibilities of this. And the professor of the unit, which covered, it was the blood unit, haemophilia and leukemia, he wrote a letter to The Guardian saying something like, "Don't you think I would know?" or some bullshit, I don't remember exactly. And I was so incensed. I didn't want to write it under my own name because the backlash against blood was already starting to build and I didn't want it to be focused.
What did the article say? What can you remember what they were talking about?
The original one.
The original
the leader
one.
article.
Yeah.
It said that there were problems with the blood and therefore the health service should be looking at the supplies and not just that, but blood products that were produced outside the country. It was a general article. Later, I did some more research, and it would have been, and this is purely a subjective view, that he was much more interested in leukemia, but since he got stipend for every haemophilia patient as well as leukemia, it was a sort of an amalgamated unit. So the letter editor of The Guardian, Patrick, was a good friend. He and his wife are good friends of Dan and I said to Patrick, I have to reply to this letter because it's bullshit what he's saying. He's lying and it's so important. Will you allow me to write it under Julia's name, his sister? He said, yes, you can. And I did. And I refuted it.
Can you remember what you wrote, Della?
Well, I mean, I read it because they had investigators up here for ages looking through the thousands of sheets. And actually, when I read it, I said to Dan, God, this is so mild. Why was I so kind? I couched it so politely.
Why do you think you were mild?
Well, because my letter said something like, I have to write in response to Professor Hardesty's thing, and to say that this matter was brought to his attention in whatever it was, 78. So anyway, he rang us up, the professor, after my riposte. Remember, I'd written it under Julia's name. He rang us at Nice Irma's, which was our business. How would he have known? So he rang and he said, could you and your husband come and see me?
Do you remember the phone call?
Yeah. Well,
Did you take it?
Yeah. Dan, if I say anything that is different from what you remember, come and say. Okay. So Dan and I went up to Great Ormond Street for this meeting. So the first thing he said was that he tested all the children in the unit.
For what?
For HIV. Nick was the only one that didn't have it. So I don't think at the time that I knew about hepatitis C, not specifically, I knew of, but not in connection with it. And amazingly, considering it was me and Irene, neither of us thought about it.
Did they ask you if they could test Nick?
No, we didn't know. Nobody knew. I said, but you never asked.
So when they said Nick was the only one that wasn't infected, were they saying that all the other children at Great Ormond Street
in the unit
that had received the treatment now had HIV?
Or Hep C.
Yeah, and he was the only one
That's what he told us.
And did they try to explain why he was the only one?
Well, they didn't have to, did they? Because they knew and we knew why he was the only one.
Why was he the only one?
Yeah, because I hadn't let them give the stuff to him. He said they're heat treating the treatment, but it's not going to be on tap till, say, January. And I think this was October.
I don't know what heat treating is. What would that do? It kills.
Yeah, it makes it pure. If you heated it at a certain level, it didn't destroy the good qualities, but it destroyed any infection. They had evidently, I found later, had been working with heat treatment in Scotland for some time, but I didn't know that then. So he said, do you want us to bring Nick into hospital till January? So this was October, and keep him immobilised until safe treatments hit. And I said, we're going home and we're going to think about it. And for me anyway, when there's something on my mind, the solutions often come to me while I'm asleep. And when I woke up in the morning, I said to Dan, you know what? The way they gave the treatment, they'd give you boxes of 10 bottles each of the treatment, and you draw up, you kept them in the fridge, and you draw up the amount you needed. But as the person got older, the amount changed. It was a weight relation. So sometimes you'd have a batch where you'd have 2 bottles over and you needed 2 1/4 bottles, but you couldn't mix batches. So you had to return it all. So I said to Dan, if they have enough ends of batches that Nicholas has already had still at Elstree, it's possible that now we know that none of them are contaminated because he isn't. If we put them all together, it might be enough treatment to get him through until the heat treatment.
So the idea was that to stop Nick getting the contaminated blood from the US, that there was enough blood left in the blood he'd been receiving.
The treatment, not the blood.
The
He
treatment.
didn't get blood. It was clear liquid. It was the clotting factor that he was injecting. Yes, and they did bring it all back, and it was enough. So he continued using the ends of batches, which he could now mix safely because we knew they were not contaminated. So then we moved him to the Royal Free, and Great Ormond Street refused to give us his file, his medical notes to take with.
Can they do that? Do you not have a right?
Yes. They said no.
So how did you get the file?
We got a phone call at work one day, and somebody said, I've taken Nick's file. If you meet us in X Street, Gower Street, I think it was, which was halfway between Great Ormond Street and us in Goodge Street, I'll give you his file.
Who was this?
It was a nurse. I can't remember now, nor can Dan, honestly not.
Yeah.
It's been too long and there's been too much. So they gave the file to us. We took it right over to the Royal Free. Now here's the thing. We looked at it with the head nurse. And on the day that I had kicked up such a fuss about them switching him, right across in tram lines, that page was written in large black letters, neurotic mother. And that pretty much encapsulates the way the medical profession thought about people, parents, anyone who objected.
Was Dan with you when you opened that folder?
Were you there, Dan, when we saw the neurotic mother? Yeah. And as far as I'm concerned, the head nurse there saw it too. And we were all shocked. When I got the file, after much struggle, when the inquiry wanted it, it wasn't there.
So it had been removed?
As far as I'm concerned, or we're concerned, it had been removed. We would have thought that any doctor worth their while would never have considered such a remark where somebody was saying, but I've got proof, look, there's this disease in San Francisco, you're getting blood from vagrants, from people who've got it, and neurotic, yeah, well.
Did the Royal Free feel like a fresh start?
Yes, it did.
How's Nick going? Because he's growing up now.
He's growing up. He's going well. I mean, he had difficulties with his ankles, and sometimes there was a lot of pain. But by that time, first we treated him, and then he learned to treat himself, and he travelled, he played badminton.
Did Nick trust the doctors? Did he talk about how he felt when he was having treatments there?
As he got older, he trusted them less and less. And we actually didn't think the hepatitis C was so serious. And the reason was, and they didn't tell us it was, that my cousin had Hep A while I was living in Israel. He was working in the mines down in Eilat. And I'd looked after him, and he got better from it. It did take about 8 weeks. And I thought, well, okay, so he's got it. And they didn't indicate it was serious.
Hepatitis C is a viral infection that causes liver inflammation. Today, it's easily diagnosed, and those infected can live a relatively normal life. But when Nick contracted hepatitis C, treatments were still being developed.
What happened was, we got a letter when Nick was 12 saying that it wasn't non-A, non-B, it was called hepatitis C, and Nick had it. but that, it was in hand and they were looking into it, and practically everybody who had had blood had got it if you hadn't got HIV.
So when you found out Nick had Hep C, who told Nick?
We told him, and he was resigned. It was like, just one more thing.
So then you mentioned there was this new treatment that was starting, I think it was in the mid-early 90s, recombinant. And you wanted Nick to go on that, even after he'd been diagnosed.
Yes.
Why was Nick denied the treatment?
Because the law said you had to be under 18, and he was about a month over it. So I wrote to Alan Milburn, who was the health secretary, and I begged him. I said, don't make Nick continue to have to inject himself with stuff that we know is not pure, because that's what they had to do.
Did Nick know at that point that it wasn't pure?
Yes, he did. And he was frightened. And people were amazing in the community. I mean, I got all sorts of emails from people saying, I'm sure I could share what I've got. I've got some recombinant, but you can't do that, not with injections, and not when you don't know. It wasn't like he did it regularly. He could go 3 weeks without hurting himself or having a bleed. And it wasn't fair. I mean, it just wasn't. And I don't know. I have to say I'm quite a brave person, but I could not imagine what Nick was going through.
I just, he's still young, and to know...
Just a month older. Yes, to have to inject yourself and know that... But he probably thought he had it already, and what the hell. So then what happened? Oh, God, I tell you. I went to a lecture given by a professor at the Royal London, and he seemed a really good person, and Nick was hardly ever going to the free. By now they were delivering the treatment to the house, and he really, and if he ever had to go there, they would grab him off. Honestly, I can't tell you how many times he'd go there because he was suddenly playing a gig out of London or something, and he didn't have enough treatment, or abroad, and they'd drag him off the reception and into a room and tell him he'd got something else. I mean, he just was frightened. He didn't want to go there anymore. He said, I don't want to go. He also had a FibroScan there, and they said his liver was getting dodgy. So I went to
Would
this...
that be from the hepatitis?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I went to this lecture, and this guy, I looked him up. He was a professor of whatever it is, the same thing, but at the Royal London. And I wrote to Irene, and I said, see if you can find out, because he studied at Stanford, and she had loads of contacts, and she knew somebody in that field. A very eminent professor said I just came across the letter the other day, a very good bloke, the guy in London, and Nick can feel in good hands. And at that time, we saw him at St Mary's. We saw him privately because Nick was in such a state. And he was wonderful. He calmed him down. He spoke to him like a human being and not a specimen. And Nick came away, and he was so happy that he could leave the free and transfer there, even though it was a right pain in the ass going to Whitechapel. It didn't matter. I mean, obviously by now he was driving himself, but he liked us to go as well. And he was with Olga. He hadn't had the baby yet because they were together a long time. Okay. So we started working with him. And they kept coming up with new trials and everything. And the trials, you can't imagine they use. I've blocked the names of them from my head because they were so toxic. They made everyone who took them so ill. I mean, you wouldn't have even known you were getting better, except that at the end of 9 months, sometimes people no longer had the virus, so it was enough to keep people taking it, but it was ghastly. And Nick had already been on, I think, at least 2 trials, one when he did his O-levels, and then after he left university, he didn't go on any there because they were doing music and he didn't want to be sick. And all the time, he was having a life. I mean, you know, he was enjoying himself in between all the other. He was an amazingly resilient kid. And Jake was resilient too, because it was really hard on him as well. For reasons neither Dan or I know, he decided he wanted to go to University College School, for which you had to sit an entrance exam. And he sat it and he got in. And we knew it would be a disaster. He was such an alternative kid. There was no way. And in the end, he got expelled for growing his hair and not wearing his blazer or something like that. But during that time, he got beaten up at University College, and that is the only time that he ever experienced it. And I think it says a lot about the idea of the sort of person who might go to a school, a paying school. I know it's a good school, and I know loads of kids have gone there. But it was weird.
Why did they beat him up?
Because he had a haemophilia.
So, right.
Specifically.
And this was the time when everything was starting to emerge around AIDS and HIV, so anything that was to do with blood, and people didn't really understand it.
Yes. Well, most people did. I mean, it was very interesting because he was absolutely open, and he had so many friends. And, you know, they moved in a wide circle. And, of course, they were really great musicians. I mean, in the end, they went on, did music at Brunel, and they opened a recording studio. They each had a band that was modularly. Nick was one of the most brilliant guitarists and did well, you know, and was very happy. I mean, that was another thing. I mean, I'm straying from the story, but the truth was that because he died so young, the one thing that Dan and I found really comforting was that the life he led till he died was exactly what he wanted. He ran a music studio, he had a band, he toured with his band abroad, America, played in festivals. He had the best of what he wanted. And we got, I can't tell you, criticised. Mothers of other children would sometimes stop me in Brent Cross and say, "We hear Mick's gone into music in that voice." And I would say, "Yes, isn't it wonderful? Jake as well." And they would go, "But it's not really a career." I said, "I guarantee you when your son qualifies as a lawyer or a doctor, they'll be wanting to go to their concerts." I mean, honestly, it's like saying, "Oh, your son became an artist," and they don't hang pictures. At a point in their lives, they realise if they don't show an interest in the arts, they're not whole people. Anyway, that's just my particular gripe.
And how did you feel towards the hospital and the medical staff? Because this is now like
the third one.
Yeah, and 18 years of fighting for him.
Yeah, well, how did I feel? I felt optimistic. I thought maybe. But then I brought the FibroScan that he'd had at the Free, which showed that there was starting to be some damage. And Graham Foster, he said, "I don't believe in FibroScans." So I didn't think a big deal at the time, or Dan. But as we went along, I consulted with a lot of people by now who I knew in the field, and it was the test for how the liver was. And he wouldn't use it, and he wouldn't give Nick one.
Why do you think Della... I mean, Nick must have seen hundreds of doctors at this point. Like, what was it about Foster that he made him believe in him?
Why? Because he had a lovely manner and he didn't treat Nick as a specimen. And Nick responded to that. He was so sick of just being a thing that you could tell, "Oh, you've got this, you've got that, you're going to die, you know, you put up with it," or whatever. And suddenly there was this very amiable guy who knew his stuff. So he wouldn't give him a FibroScan. He didn't think Nick's liver was particularly bad. They did other tests. We went there one day and he said, "NICE have just approved something that I think is the right one for Nick, but it's a really hard one." And he discussed it all with Nick and with Olga. By now, Olga was coming to everything. I think they hadn't had the baby. They may have had...
So he's in his
20s
now? Late 20s?
He was, yes, late 20s. And they agreed for him to start. And it was like...
What was the treatment?
I've got it written down somewhere. It was whatever the latest one was, but it contained ribavirin and something. It was so terrible. It brought him out in these terrible, ugly sores all over his legs and his body. So Olga, who at the time was a physio, would bathe his legs and treat them and help him as much as they could. And he would go, and Graham would look at him. He'd go every week, I think we went. And we went too, because I was really not happy. And I said, he really, really should have a transplant. I said, I'll give him half my liver. What can I do? No, he's nowhere near it. He's nowhere near needing that. And he'd send him up to the, whatever they call it, where they look at skin lesions and things. And we'd sit for hours before they'd see him, and he was in agony. And then on one occasion, they see him, and I go into the room with him, and he lays down, and she's looking at these lesions, and she said, I'm just going to take a biopsy, and she gets a knife. And I go, you can't do that. He's a haemophiliac. And she looks at his notes, and she says, doesn't say he is here. I said, take it from me. He's a haemophiliac. I'm his mother.
So wait, in his medical notes...
Yeah, it didn't say he was a haemophiliac. Yeah. So she had no reason to think she couldn't just take this biopsy. And then the next thing that happened was he went to a conference in, I think it was Japan. And when he came back, Nicholas was in such a bad way. And I remember him kneeling down and looking at Nick's legs and going in this sort of admiring voice, this is the worst I've ever seen. I told them about it at the conference.
What, that it was a symptom of the treatment and that he was kind of intrigued by it?
Yeah, he used him as a sort of an example, but in this terrible way. And Nick, who rarely got discomforted by this point, was really upset. And I said, he's not a specimen. Don't talk about him like that. Help him. I said, don't send him up for 2 hours. And then, I said, help him. And then Irene died in San Francisco. She'd been ill, and her husband, who we didn't get on with, rang and said she died. And I really loved her. She'd been my best friend my whole life. We'd travelled together. As far as I was concerned, she'd saved Nick's life. And I talked with Olga and Nick, and I said, we'll just go to the memorial, and then I'll come home. And by then we were in this flat, and Nick used to come up, and he'd lay on there. We had special sheets, so we'd cover it, and he would have the blinds up, and he'd look at the sky.
So he was really poorly by this?
He was really poorly. So we went, and when we came back, he was so ill, and I said to Graham, I don't understand. Take some of my liver and do this and do that. And he said, it was too late. And then, maybe a week later, Olga rang us and said, Nick's really ill, really ill. We ran over there. They only live in Muswell Hill. Her parents were over. And Eve was born by then. She was about 9 months old. Olga, who was still a physio, and I were ringing for 2 hours. They would not send an ambulance. So I would say, and I say to everybody, if you ever need an ambulance, just say the person's had a heart attack. It's the only thing they'll come for. I said, he's a haemophiliac, we think he's got liver failure. Then they said, how old is he? How long is he? I mean, it was terrible. And in the end, we got a private ambulance, very, very expensively, and terrible conditions. And Dad went in the ambulance with Nick. Olga and her parents and I and the baby followed to the Royal London. And he was admitted into this specialist unit for emergencies. Graham's staff were there and they were on the phone to Graham. They gave him morphine. He was in terrible, terrible state. So then he slept because the pain had gone. And they said, why don't you use this moment to have a cup of tea? We're taking him up to intensive care, and when you finish, go up and see him. We weren't 15 minutes. We went up, and this fucking sadistic bastard wouldn't let us in.
A nurse? Was it a nurse or
a male nurse? He wouldn't let us in. So we slept on the floor outside that night, and Lynn had rung to find out what was happening. She got permission to leave Parliament, and she came and slept there too. And in the morning, when they found out she was an MP, they found us a little room in intensive care. But by then, he had been sedated and was on life support. So we never saw him alive again. And this sadistic fucking bastard who kept us out, he was so awful, so rude to Olga, so unkind. And eventually Graham turned up and he survived about 2 days or something. And we were in there the whole time, but he never regained consciousness. And this guy, and so I reported the nurse, and someone came over and took notes, but nothing ever happened. And we never got into the ambulance. It was too much for us. And Olga stayed that night in the hospital, and they rang in the middle of the night, and we ran over there, and we were with him when he died. But he never regained consciousness. They were hateful, incompetent, disgusting people. That's the story.
Della, how, after everything that you've been through, when doctor after doctor had lied to you, and then at the end you weren't even treated with dignity, so you didn't get to say goodbye, how did you go on? I'm just thinking, as a parent, I'd be full of anger and hate and so much resentment that I wouldn't even know how to. I'd want to blame that on someone or something, even to be able to wake up in the morning.
Well, that's exactly how I felt. And from that day on, I campaigned to do the only thing that would ever... I mean, I would have sued them privately if we were richer. I mean, they're a right bunch of bastards. Self-seeking, interested really in the medical aspects, but not in the human aspects. Not really. I mean, the fact the last one considered him a specimen. So I didn't know this at the time, but Jake wrote an absolutely intense letter to Foster, which I've now seen, saying all of what I've said. And I am sure, I don't know exactly, but I know that a lot of the people named will be called. I don't exactly know. I actually wrote to the inquiry this week and asked them, are they going to have to appear? Do they have to defend themselves? Oh, I don't know yet. I haven't had an answer. I only just wrote.
Have you got any answers through the process that you didn't know?
No, none. I've seen what happened to us repeated again and again and again. The only difference is that I became aware for a lot of people that within their families they'd been told, the children, not to say they had haemophilia because I don't know why. And I have no answers yet. And obviously one is hoping that the inquiry will provide some of that. I mean, God knows, it's not just me who had so much evidence, many, many people. I mean, because I'm a core participant, I get everybody's what's going on. And it could be a mirror copy with slight differences in that I did have an idea and I did on record try and stop all that. But no, lying, cheating, money, self-aggrandizement, doctors whose interest is scientific rather than personal. I don't know, but all I know is that Nick was so brave. What he endured, and Olga too. Many are still sick, Many, and many haven't even developed it all yet. It takes ages to show, unfortunately.
Nothing can bring Nick back, but is there something that could happen in the inquiry that you would feel in some way that this may not happen again?
No, I actually don't think that if the same thing happened again in some other form for some other group, maybe the doctors would reflect twice. I know that Lynn, my sister, and Lynn Kelly from Wales went to see the French foreign minister, who is now, I think, at Oxford or Cambridge. He was imprisoned in France for several years after this, when it was discovered there, as were others.
Well, it was found out in France.
That was in France.
Yeah.
I mean, I had a look at what happened around the world. I commissioned somebody to do a report for me. And different countries had different ways. I think probably this is the first really proper public inquiry that's been into it. And would it happen again? It's money, you know. In the end, that's what I said. They asked me to do the opening speech last September. And I said that the real crime in this is that this whole cohort of professional medical people, whether they did it together or individually, decided to keep it a secret. And by doing so, they stopped the opportunity that the drug companies would find a solution. I said, so you delayed it by 30 years or 20 years, because if there had been the outcry then, when I was saying it, I said, do you think they would have carried on using and producing contaminated stuff from contaminated blood? Of course they wouldn't. They're only in it for the money, the drug companies. They would have immediately had people working on a safe thing. I said, but because the doctors and the medical profession all over the world connived to keep it a secret, it delayed it by 30 years. And all of our children died. Nearly all of them.
Della, if people listening are angry and outraged around this story, is there anything they can do?
I don't think so, except in their cases, God forbid anything like this occurs in their life. Talk about it, fight it, write letters about it. Don't keep quiet and don't be ashamed. Stand up. You might save your own children.
Thank you for sharing the story and trusting us with it. You are really a remarkable woman.
Thank you.
To give you a sense of the magnitude of what happened and why Della is tragically not alone, between 1970 and 1999, the Department of Health estimate more than 30,000 people were infected with hepatitis C following treatment with contaminated NHS blood products. To date, however, just under 6,000 infected patients have been identified. At the time of this podcast recording, the infected blood inquiry is still in progress. To learn more, or if you have information you'd like to report, please go to infectedbloodinquiry.co.uk. And if you'd like to speak to someone, support is available from the Red Cross, who can be contacted on 0800 458 9473.